Good evening, everyone. My name is James Zeno, and I'm joined here today by Rupert August, and we're going to talk about Emperorship in China and Emperorship, Kingship in European frame of reference, and we're going to be comparing them, discussing them. Welcome, Rupert. I know that I've seen some videos of yours on monarchy in Europe, and I've been impressed by them. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about it. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, you probably know a good chunk of what I'm going to talk about already then, if you've already watched some of those.
Well, I'm looking forward to be able to ask you questions about it. I think that's part of what I'm looking forward to, being able to pick your brains about it, because this subject matter to me is very, very interesting, because both in their similarities and differences, I think we can find some things that are common ground and differences there, and as also we'll be linking them to what there are legacies in stone, either with regards to what they build in castles, walls. And it's interesting to think about how our ideas of monarchy and emperorship lead downstream from those archetypes that we're going to talk about to what they build.
Yeah, definitely. I'm coming at it from a very layman's understanding of the Chinese side of things, so yeah, it'll be informative on my part as well.
Well, I'd like to think I know a fair bit about Western history, but admittedly, I have been ploughing the furrow of Chinese history for many years now. So I've always, I get the gist of our own history, but perhaps it's not something I would admit to having expertise in. So yeah, it's good to have you here.
Yes, excellent. Thank you. Thank you for having me on again. And well, actually,
right.
Before we properly get started, should we talk about the one of the links that brings us here? The
yeah, thank you. Thanks for reminding me. I was going to bring that up later, but I suppose that's a good point to mention it. Well, I mentioned that what these emperors brought out and these kings brought out in stone, because me and Rupert were both appreciators of castles, could I say, Rupert?
Certainly, very much so.
And I suppose that is the thing that brought us together. We're working on reviving and revitalizing our castles of our isles, our British castles, and that's something that we're working on at the moment.
Restoration, I think, is an excellent word with a lot of connotations, but hopefully not just the structures themselves, but some of the ethics around them and appreciation for them and all that kind of thing as well. So, if anyone listening thinks that that's something that they'd like to support, then yeah, go and have a look up the Pendragon Foundation and see if you want to get involved.
That's right, Pendragon Foundation. We're working with Nathan Hood on that, and it's really excellent, all of us working together, because we all have our different strengths, and it's a place where everyone can bring their skills to the fore to show, because we really need people to get on board and help us. So whatever, to save our castles. So because no one else is going to do it, are they? If not us, then who?
Yeah, certainly, and especially with the state of they call it the third sector, or the charity sector and such being as it is. Yeah, definitely need some fresh blood and some fresh ideas.
Absolutely, and I think that is something that's going to come out from what we're speaking about. In times of history, across civilizations, when people have ignored their heritage, whether that's in the Chinese context of the walls or the palaces, that's a sure sign of something going wrong. That isn't any different anywhere, really. So the fact that we're living through that time is disturbing, but also the fact that we're living through a time where people are coming together to rebuild them again, and that's encouraging, and that hasn't been thought about for a good 100 years, because we've being so reliant upon the model of just, tourists will come and see the buildings. We can see now for ourselves it's not good enough. That will not survive the future.
So it would seem, yeah. So, here's to, as I said, fresh blood and fresh ideas.
Yes.
Yes, without further ado, should we get into it then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Rupert, would you like to tell us about your first monarch or your first archetype of that? That's something we talked about before we came on here, that we'll be talking about archetypes. So is that your first one, Rupert?
Well, I'm coming at it from the angle of what is defining different types of Western monarchs. And I would put it down to two axes, essentially. There is the legitimacy axis and the model of centralization or lack thereof, model of administration, perhaps. So you have legitimacy by civic justification, essentially. So treating the polity as something in itself which is to be served, perhaps. And this is kind of where you get rulers coming in who are considering themselves something like the first servant of state or the first citizen, or things like that. That's a very old idea in itself, although it gets associated with the French Revolutionary period and beyond. On the other hand, you have something more like divine right, where there is a generally metaphysical justification, and so the monarch's position in that sense is unquestionable from a civic perspective, and the institutions are almost built around that fact. Again, divine right of kings, pretty much a lot of the things that you associate with that idea, as I just say, it is, probably more or less correct, but we'll get into it a little bit later. On the other hand, you have the different models of centralization, and that is centralization which attempts to perhaps level in some fashion, or just create some kind of like absolutism would be a shorthand way of putting it, although the periods that we associate with absolutism are yes, Charles I. You
mentioned divine right of kings, so I was lagging behind there. There you go.
Yeah, well, Filmer is a good figure for that. So Robert Filmer. But yes, centralization, so leveling versus something more like feudalism, absolutism versus feudalism, you could think. In the case of feudalism, you're talking about a monarch that is, and these all have sort of ideals and people who do it well and people who do it poorly. So in the case of feudalism, you'd be talking about someone who is very good at managing the relationships between their subordinates. So the subordinates retain quite a lot of their power, but certainly both in theory and in practice. But the king is very good at managing those relationships and ensuring that he can get people on side in the correct ways at the correct times.
You mentioned, excuse me, Rupert. You mentioned a good example of this. Is there any example you could point towards from history that would be a good example of that model?
Of feudalism in particular?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Again, I'm not talking about like everything that's entailed with that, but when I say that, you kind of know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be, to my mind, someone like Henry II. Now, it's a little bit complicated because, yes, Henry II of England, I should have said. It's a little bit complicated by the fact that usually monarchs are constantly trying to accrue more power to themselves and not be contingent on the goodwill of their notables. But Henry II is a good example, even though he was kind of moving towards this centralizing power in his own way and did so quite successfully in a lot of cases. But his empire, the Angevin Empire, represented almost like one of the most feudal empires, in the sense that it was just a collection of fiefs that were held by lords who were associated either by some form of alliance or by marriage or by that kind of arrangement to Henry II himself. So the mostly in the possessions in France, for example, held by either legacy Norman lords who had realms both in Normandy and in England, but even more so his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, which gave him significant territories affiliated with him and paying homage to him, at least Aquitaine, around Bordeaux and Gascony and all that kind of region. I think pushing all the way up into Perigord, perhaps. Quite far east, further east than you might think, if you don't know much about the period. But again, this in a way it's very brittle, and you kind of see how brittle it is later on. But during Henry II's lifetime, he is able to do a pretty damn good job of keeping it all together and keeping everyone on side. But if you have a quick look at the a map of the Angevin Empire, then you'll see what I mean. There you go. Everything red.
Is that a good map? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
But again, almost all of that is, if you look at the legend there as well, it kind of gives you some idea about like how loosely connected both of these realms are. Even the Kingdom of France, which you would assume at face value was more centralized, but that was not so either necessarily. So in particular, the county of Toulouse down there in the southeast is still paying homage to the King of France, but has a great deal of autonomy. But in effect, is although there are legal bindings that keep them tied to the Kingdom of France, and they pay homage and everything, the extent of their autonomy is such that they can enjoy effectively de facto independence, and their continued subservience to the King of France is, as much due to legality as it is due to the goodwill of the Count of Toulouse himself. So I would say that's pretty much the hallmark of this type of Western monarchy.
Yeah, pardon me, I interrupted your flow there. I was asking for a good example of a feudal king, and that's you were talking about just before there. You're getting to defining it. Do go on.
Well, so by contrast, you have absolutist monarchy, which is a monarchy which does not rely on the goodwill of anyone else in particular, and usually it's characterized by having parallel power structures which have been created. If you've ever heard of the phrase, no, that doesn't really work in this context, but a common strategy is what's known as the high-low versus middle, and this is more of a transitory step, really, in the accumulation of power and the centralizing of power. But in the royalist context, it sort of usually represents an alliance of sorts with the commoners against the notables to try and curtail their power. That doesn't need to be done indefinitely, of course, because there comes a stage where the notables are effectively toothless. But that doesn't necessarily have to mean titled aristocrats. It's equally just a bureaucracy that has become powerful unto itself and exhibits more autonomy than is desired by the central authority. The king in most of these cases. I would say the most perfect iteration of this is the very late autocrats of Imperial Russia. So in particular,
Romanovs.
Yeah, the late Romanovs specifically. So you'd be talking about Alexander III and Nicholas II, which he got Nicholas II there. But in both of these cases, the commoners and the nobility were not completely defanged. They obviously still existed, but they were part of a grand single structure. What do they call it? I think it might have been called the Table of Titles or something like that, where effectively the entirety of society, especially the entirety of society that is, not at the very bottom rung of being, just peasantry or something, were all organized into a hierarchy with obviously the Tsar at the top, or the Emperor at the top rather, and kind of everyone knew their place, as it were, regardless of what sphere you're in, and there aren't like particularly parallel power structures. There's no like authorities or precedents that the Tsar particularly needs to appeal to. He is effectively the patrimonial ruler of all the rushes. So goes the title. And basically everything is more or less subordinated to his will. He doesn't really have to placate anyone in particular.
It's interesting that you mentioned the lower and upper cooperation in a way, and this being an example of that. Because am I right in saying in some ways the communists came in and sold themselves as appealing to the lower, but in fact they weren't themselves of that that group in more ways than one.
Yeah, so ideologically they were trying to appeal to the working classes as their justification, the proletariat. Although there was kind of some amount of overtures to the peasantry as well, but that was considered quite against ideological doctrine. But in practice, who they mostly ended up appealing to were various ethnic groups who wanted their particular ethnic considerations elevated.
And always, I remember one of the things that probably it shocked me in the past 5 years is to come to the realization that yes, the ruling dynasty of the Manchus, when they were taken down, they suffered along with the times in China, with the Cultural Revolution and all of that tumultuous time period. But many of them survived into their old age. Puyi, the last emperor, died in the 1970s, believe it or not. That was quite a shock to me when I realized that despite the fact that they had good reason to harbor resentment, the majority Chinese, the Han Chinese, they had good reason to harbor resentment against them because they were they didn't consider themselves Chinese, the Manchus, although of course they did adapt and so on. But anyway, I'm getting to the point. The point is that despite all that reason for resentment, many of them didn't experience the horrors that the Romanovs experienced. And that was one of the things to me that I found horrific to realize, oh, crikey, what happened to them was so awful. And it didn't happen in China. And, well, it's interesting to think about why, let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you could just point to the idea that that by that point, Puyi had been he'd been outmoded. He was toothless by that point politically, whereas all of these other monarchs were certainly not. So Nicholas, in particular, would have been considered he was considered a rallying point for the white cause of sorts, and it turns out he wasn't. But there was a potentially legitimate fear that he would be an anchoring point for foreign influence as well, or foreign intervention, basically in the war, to a much greater extent than happened as was. But I mean, it'd be a whole other thing to go into it detail. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the foreign influence didn't end up being on the white side, and probably was never really going to be significantly on the white side anyway. But yeah, that's a whole other rabbit hole.
You mentioned also, Rupert, a tension between centralization and distributed power. That's probably been one of the themes that I might get to a little bit later with the Chinese comparisons, because that was always been a tension throughout Chinese history of the 5,000 years of falling apart only to come together again. Over time, different emperors have come up with sort of different solutions as to how to keep it all together. And is that something that the Romanovs dealt with as well? That idea of centralization of power and distributed power?
The only problems they really come up against, the Romanovs, is that there was so after the 1905 revolution, Nicholas II did have to acquiesce to a constitution of sorts, a Duma in particular, and there were certain problems that came about because of that. So although that was, the effective freedom of that was curtailed very quickly, the main consequence that it had was that Duma members were given de facto immunity from prosecution until they were, investigated or like had some kind of like basically there was a procedural method within the Duma as to how they would be subject to criminal charges. But up until that point, they were effectively immune to the law, and that became a problem in 1916 and 17, where I think it was Milyakov and some other associated sort of like liberals and leftists were plotting with the British in order to orchestrate some kind of coup. Hard to say really how much of that really came through as a, in light of the events as they actually transpired, because, he ended up being an emigre, and to my knowledge, most of the people who were involved in that ended up becoming emigres. So it might have been that they were plotting, but they were kind of bypassed by events. But it's, hard to say. There's still a lot of fog around that era.
Indeed, there was. Yeah. So, yeah, that's been an interesting run through from Henry II, and we've talked about the Romanovs. And we've also been mentioning the sort of legacies in stone of these people. Is that something you get into, or do you want to bring that up a bit later?
I can bring it up briefly now, just while we're on the topic,
sure.
So it doesn't get left behind. Funnily enough, on this subject, Machiavelli comes up as being broadly correct in his assessment when he mentions in The Prince that the difference between sort of decentralized versus centralized realms in this regard, in particular the taking over of them, is that a decentralized realm will be easier to become head of, basically to become prince or king. But once that position is attained, then there will be a great deal of resistance within, and it will be hard to maintain that position. Whereas in the case of a very centralized realm, using the Ottomans as the example, I think the examples given were France versus the Ottoman Empire. And in a very centralized realm, it will be very difficult to sort of beat them, but there will be a lot of resistance. But there will be much less resistance, once that first sort of wall is broken through, as it were. And that comparison is made very deliberately, because one thing you tend to see in these two different types of realms is that a more absolutist realm will tend to have very strong, or comparably very strong, sort of outer defenses, and so some kind of invasion or penetration will be much more difficult at that first line of contact. They'll have a larger army, they'll have more organized defenses, they'll have stronger castles, all of the edges of the realm. But once you break through there, then there's not necessarily quite as much on the interior.
Yeah.
Comparably, feudal realms are marked by, because a lot of the times a lot of these figures want to preserve their power internally as well as externally, there will be a lot of fortifications that are internal to the polity, and consequently, although you might be able to cross the frontier, you will not necessarily be able to, once you cross the frontier, it's not necessarily a clear sailing. So you might have to deal with a lot of powerful fortifications, even very far into the realm, into the interior of the realm, and you'll never or it will take a very long time for you to hit a kind of soft underbelly.
That rings true to the Chinese civilizational frame of reference in general. A lot of their equivalent legions would be stationed in the northwest and the northeast. But once you get through there, resistance, well, there would still be heavy resistance, but once the horse peoples broke through on the 4 or 5 occasions when they did through Chinese history, with the end of the Han, and then there are, you could argue, other occasions during the Tang maybe, but the main occasions of the Yuan, the Mongol takeover of China, and of course the Manchus we've been talking about already, that pattern you've mentioned there very much rings true. Once the walls were gone, Beijing, for example, was always exposed to being taken over too easily because it was very close to the wall. And that's what happened with the fall of the Ming, which we will get into later.
Yeah. Holds true for Rome as well, later on especially. So when the under the later dominate, the frontier is very strong, but sort of once you're through into the productive regions, it's very difficult to be kicked out. But yeah, I mean, conversely, I mean, funnily enough, though, on the topic of the Mongols, that's one of the things about the hypothetical invasion of the Mongols into further Central Europe. You know, obviously, in our history, they only really got as far as Hungary, with some slight raids slightly further afield. But had they been able to get further, some people like to say that European civilization might have come to an end, but being that they did tend to struggle more so with unfriendly geography and a lot of fortifications, they would have had absolute hell with Germany being, especially somewhere like Austria, being covered in fortifications and castles and all that kind of stuff. Again, for this kind of like feudal reason, basically, of having like a lot of different lords who are trying to protect their own domains in one way or another. And obviously the geography itself becomes a lot more inhospitable to their particular way of warfare. So
yeah, it is interesting to consider. I suppose one thing that's obvious is just Europe is quite far from their base. I know the definition of horse peoples, you could go anywhere, couldn't you, from having their basing anywhere from sort of Kazakhstan to, or even Eastern Hungary, all the way to Mongolia. But it just so happens that Mongol base sprang from pretty far east. So that once they get to Europe, they're pretty far from their base. So, like you said, they're very in very unfamiliar terrain once they get to Europe.
Well, it's a general trend in a lot of different nomadic groups where they sort of pass through from east to west. They might head through modern day Romania, Bulgaria. They might get into the Pannonian Plain in modern day Hungary, but then they kind of just get cramped up, squashed there basically, and they've got nowhere else to go beyond that point because the territory is no longer amenable to that lifestyle. So they either get pushed into the Pannonia basin, or they just get cooped up in somewhere around what's called Bulgaria or Romania, and they just hit the various mountain ranges in the area and can't really go any further.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, indeed. And history. The proof is in the pudding, isn't it? They didn't get any further for a reason. Unfortunately for China, because that was a pretty bad period of time. It's pretty hard to estimate populations, but many censuses give a clear drop, especially in the north of China, for that century when it was the Mongol Yuan dynasty. And I've always found it interesting. This is something I've always found interesting. The first interaction that's recorded and thoroughly evidenced with Marco Polo occurs during the Mongol dynasty, and it's always interested me that the fact that our first impression of China, and in some ways it's still coloured by that sometimes. We refer, don't we, to did Kublai Khan in Xanadu? We all know that the Tennyson, is it Tennyson? Yeah, the Tennyson poem, or is it Coleridge? Correct me if I'm wrong.
I'm not sure.
Anyway, it's always interested me that that interaction was the first one, but at the same time, the elite at that time were not Chinese, so we've had a sort of false impression of China from the very beginning, And also back when we turn up with gunboats during the 1800s, that was also a China disunited, a China at war with itself. I mean, they were on the way to the Taiping Rebellion, which had an ethnic undertone. Although, of course, Hong Shouquan, the man who started the Taiping Rebellion, that wasn't an expressed, articulated goal to restore Chinese rule in China, but it did take on an aspect of that over time. Many people joined the Taiping cause because of the fact that they were not Manchus. So it's always interested me that those two time periods when the West has interacted with China, it's been when China, I suppose, in a way, it would be like China judging Europe now, right? We're obviously not in control of our own destiny at the moment, although of course we can be. But it would be like China getting a judgment of Europe from now. That's always interested me.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my understanding of the Taiping Rebellion, especially how it grew so big, was that a lot of different groups just attached whatever they wanted onto it. They like whatever grievances they had with the Qing, they just grafted a remedy of that onto the Hong. How do you pronounce his name? Hong
Shouquan.
So yeah, he just kind of became an avatar for whatever grievances people had, and that's how it got so big, along with a number of bandit groups all just sort of tagging along as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and indeed, it's also one of the decisive factors. Of course, a lot of people might know of the famous Gordon. I think his name was Charles Gordon. He ended up in Khartoum at one point, I think, but he also helped the British. I don't think the official navy, but sort of pseudo navy, protecting the people they had in Shanghai and the business interests. They sided with the Manchus purely because, and this was their stated reason, the Manchus owed them so much in debt. So the decisive factor in that war was, in many ways, European help. Which is a shame, really, because, well, the Manchus were destined to fall anyway, very, very soon after the Taiping Rebellion.
Well, my understanding is that the general European disposition towards the Taiping was not actually that great anyway, because they were also considered dangerous radicals, not meaningfully Christian either. Although we kind of remember that one. But
you are right. I've looked into it. The sort of expressed ideology of some of the Taipings was very confused. I mean, this is a time period where Christianity was only really just reaching the inland. I know we'd had Jesuits since the Ming, but they were mostly in the capital and very few. This was a real time period where we were getting missionaries in great numbers. The great James Legge, who translated most of the classics, arrives in Hong Kong in this time period. And in fact, this was quite surprising for me to discover. Hong Wengan was Hong Shouquan's cousin, and he took part in the Taiping Rebellion. He met James Legge in Hong Kong and helped James Legge translate some of the Analects and the classics. So it's very ironic to me that the Hong Shouquan was sent mad. This is the official story. I don't know. I'm not sure how true this is, but the official story goes, Hong Shouquan tries to take the official entrance exam to become an imperial mandarin, right? You have to take this Kurju, this imperial exam. He tries to take it so many times. He's driven mad by failure because, well, his whole family's savings have been put towards his education, and this is his only way of getting into a career. He's spent so long studying it. And that the very content of that exam is mostly the Chinese classics, like Confucius. So his cousin ends up helping James Legge translate the first classics into English. So there's the old 6 steps between someone and someone else. James Legge is only 2 steps from a man driven insane by Confucius in some ways.
Yeah, it is curious. I'd never like thought to put doubt on that story, but yeah, I guess it is a good way of also disregarding the figure as just like a madman, and basically refusing to acknowledge any of his claims.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyway, that seems like a pretty good segue in general for what Chinese decentralization actually looks like, because it looks quite different to European decentralization, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I'll begin with my first archetype, then Rupert. Sounds like a good
go ahead.
Segue. Okay. So, we're talking about 2000 BC. One of the archetypes who emerge from the Chinese written record is that of the early benevolent sage king, that of the emperors Yao and Shun. Their reigns were from around 2000 BC, 2300 BC to around 2205 BC. We read of things in the Shiji about this, in the records of the grand historian from Sima Qian, as they were the people who united the various parts of their domain in bonds of peace. I'm quoting here, so that concord reigned among the black-haired people. So these are not. We don't have written records from contemporaries at this time. These are figures of legend, and they brought the peoples of the Yellow River region together, the Yellow River civilizations, which was the foundation of Chinese civilization. Then we read about, after that, the great Emperor Yao abdicating in favor of Shun. Now, this is a very, very rare exception to the rule in Chinese history. And now whether this happened or not is, I suppose, besides the point here. I mean, even in European histories, this is very rare. Usually it goes by lineage, or whoever holds the power, whichever way we define that. But we have examples here going right back to 2000 BC of people abdicating to someone who is a good model. We're further told that Shun was chosen because of his great filial piety. So obviously we see coming through here the Confucian influences upon the writer Sima Qian in the records of the grand historian, who was a self-professed Confucian. He did like Confucius. And apparently this enabled Shun to live in harmony with an unprincipled father, a shifty stepmother, and an arrogant half-brother. So, I mean, I'm going to give more examples of archetypes in Chinese history that are more thoroughly evidenced with contemporary scholars and evidence we can point to. This is, we're going right back here to 2000 BC. So I mentioned their legacies in stone. This is not something I can point towards with these legendary emperors, but it's interesting to me that going back, all the way back, we have this idea that monarchy or emperorship can be passed down via just the person who's deemed greatest, rather than for any other reason.
Yeah, it reminds me of the 5 good emperors in Rome, where they had a similar string of emperors all passing power to someone who was basically considered a worthy successor, not necessarily a blood descendant.
It's interesting that in both cases, we're talking about legends here. We're not talking about something that is, up for sort of historical debate, but generally accepted as true. Am I right, or is this something that's solidly evidenced?
Yeah, the five good emperors are pretty solidly evidenced. So
Yeah.
Marcus Aurelius, for example, being the last one.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. I thought we were talking about Rome. Pre sort of legendary. The two feeding from the wolf's nipple and all that kind of thing back then.
No, so there are the Roman kings, but there is to some extent a similar thing, but there's not really that much information about them, and I believe they did still work in a dynasty, with the exception of a couple. So Romulus, the first king, was not a relation of, I think it was Numa that came next, and I'm not sure that Numa had any descendants either. So yeah, similar situation in that regard.
And are these sort of similar time periods then? I think it's not so early with Rome. Am I right?
You'd be talking much more recent with Rome. I don't remember the exact time scale of it, but it's like maybe 7th, 8th century BC.
Mm-hmm.
I'll double check that.
Whilst you double check that, I just had a thought. You mentioned about decentralized and centralized power. I mean, this time period, this would be the Shah dynasty. The territory is pretty small on the Yellow River. We're not talking about a very huge territory here, which would really come into being under the Qin dynasty from sort of 200 BC onwards. So I don't think that was such a problem. Did you get that date yet for the?
Yeah, it is the 8th century.
Okay.
8th century BC. And yes, it was Romulus, then Numa, then Tullus. And I don't think any of those were directly blood related to one another.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is interesting that we have comparative examples of this in legend that are passed to the most capable person. Now, here's a thought I had whilst thinking about these archetypes. I've got between 2 and 3, and we'll see if we've got time for another one later. Is that after this, through Chinese history, it's always by lineage. It's always by lineage, or whichever son of the emperor gets, put into power by his powerful mother or his powerful clan. But this is the rare exception until now. Whether you agree with it or not, that's besides the question. It's until the present day. I mean, I know we can put aside how she got into power, but at least within their story, they're saying it's the most capable man who comes next, right? For example, Deng Xiaoping was put into the farms and suffered through the 60s, but then he was brought back into the fold. So it's quite interesting that we could debate whether they are the most suitable men, but within their frame of reference, this is the first time they're doing that again, and it's not just by lineage.
Well, my understanding is that in the case of the emperors by lineage, a lot of them, especially during certain periods that you could probably point to, were effectively defanged and just kept almost as like ornaments in a way, just sequestered off so much that they had no proper understanding of what is going on in the realm, and they were raised by such lofty levels of ceremony that they could not effectively rule because they had no conception of what ruling actually was, and so they become more just ceremonial figures that only technically rule over a civil service or an apparatus or an administration that basically just completely bypasses them and ignores them. Would that be accurate? Would you say?
For now in Europe.
Well, yeah, in Europe it's the the same thing in that case, but yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. I think we can certainly say that as two men sitting in England now, our monarch has fits that description, and also in the Zhou dynasty.
Just quickly in the European context, even before now, there have been cases of that, but it's much more isolated, and to my knowledge, there's for one thing, it's not as institutionalized, and it's not. It's like often one-time things. So the most famous example that comes to mind is the Frederick the Great. He was a figure who wanted to kind of do a lot of things himself, sort of by hand, not in the sense of like getting personally involved in micromanaging things and just making reforms and improving the lot of his people, but sometimes, much to his personal frustration, his advisors and subordinates would give him basically. So when he was touring the realm, they would give him a completely artificial picture of what was going on. So everybody would be. So for example, they get rid of all the criminals out of town. They would like repaint everything. They'd like put up facades and things, and they would make things a lot more rosier for Frederick than they actually were. Which, again, Frederick was very unhappy about that, because he was, again, to go back to my frame, he wanted to be working more in the absolutist model. He wanted to centralize, and part of that centralization was trying to actually improve things, which requires him to actually know what's going on the ground. Which, if he doesn't know, if he can't see what things are actually like, then he can't reform properly.
I suppose with that in mind, the Chinese model is very hard to know everything that's going on the ground, and we'll get to this later. Actually, my next archetype sort of we'll get into that a little bit. Shall I get on with my next archetype now, Rupert?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So next one is the aloof conqueror. Now, Qin Shi Huang, the unifier in 221 BC, after the long decline of the Zhou dynasty, they got to a stage of they held nominal power in the center of a fragmented territory, but they didn't have any power at all. The dukes of the feudal states were warring and paid them lip service, but they didn't have any power. Qin Shi Huang emerges from the Qin dynasty with almost, even from birth, a mythical story. We don't even know for sure who his father was. It's either Prince Qian or Lu Buwei, who was a businessman, ironically enough, in a state who's supposed to hate businessmen. The Qin state was set up to, basically after the reforms of Shanyang and legalism in the 300s, to be a state where only soldiering and farming gains you status. Anyway, so he emerges from this ether, this sort of fog-like childhood, to take over and oversee the unification of the warring states. And that's what I mentioned earlier, where China as a concept combines those two river systems, the Yellow River and the Yangtze, the Changjiang, for the first time during the Qin dynasty. And that has until now been the core of Chinese civilization. The western bits can come and go, and the northeastern bits can come and go, but that's the core of Chinese civilization. That's the core breadbasket and the core of the people throughout Chinese history. So I was mentioning earlier how the ruler can know what's going on the ground, and this is one way they knew, was by touring. Now, I know we can say, well, certain things can be put in front of them, but that's at least their attempt to get to what's going on. So we saw also, similarly to Qin Shi Huang's imperial progresses that we can see there, Deng Xiaoping did the same thing, famously going down to Shenzhen and the coastal cities and touring around. You even see maybe probably not when I was there, but maybe a little bit before when I was there. I was there in the mid 2000s. Maybe in the late 90s, you'd see pictures of Deng, or in mid 90s, pictures of Deng everywhere. You know, he's visited this place. There'll be a picture of him, you know, giving the sign of approval to their market style reforms in that vicinity. And that's been one of the ways of the quote unquote aloof aloof conqueror that I mentioned there, because he's in the Chinese archetype. This is repeated throughout history of emperors being aloof and yet wanting to get down on the ground. I know this is it seems like a contradiction in terms, but at the same time as Qin Shi Huang is described as in his own palace, going round on these raised platforms to never interact with people. At the same time as that, you have him going out on these tours constantly going round and round. It's the subject of quite a few films about his life. For example, The Emperor's Shadow, 1996, if anyone is curious. I enjoyed it. He's going around touring all these places, leaving markers to write down, you know, he's been to this holy mountain and he saw it at this date and this time, constantly going on these tours. So that's the second archetype of Chinese emperorship, this sort of aloof and yet a man who wants to see what's going on, because of course on these tours he experiences one of his 3 recorded assassination attempts by a former Mandarin of the state of Han, Zhang Liang, who is recorded as hiring a henchman to make a huge, something like 50 kilogram iron cone to hurl at the imperial chariot as it passes by. And he very, very nearly kills Qin Shi Huang. So even within the historical record, it's quite hard to tell much about the man himself and what he was actually like, but one can make a few deductions. For example, he was brave. I mean, would a man who wasn't brave continue to go on a tour when their life is in danger out in the road? No, they'll probably, you know, bunk up, shack up in the palace and just stay there. So yeah, that would be my second archetype of the Chinese ruler, the aloof conqueror. And one final thing to add to that is that throughout Chinese history, you don't get many soldier rulers, very few. There is one exception to the rule that I'll bring up later, but these are not men who lead from the front. Despite the fact that he went on tours, he wouldn't actually be a soldier. He would, you know, rule from the palace and have his generals do the work. But there is one exception to the rule of that. So I'm wondering, with these monarchs that you've mentioned so far, Rupert, were any of these men who led from the front? Henry II, perhaps?
Henry II did, yes. Funnily enough, Nicholas II put himself in charge. He made himself commander-in-chief of the army as well during World War One. So there's that to an extent. If I had to pick a comparison figure, I would probably think of either Charles XII or of Sweden, that is, or Peter the Great, maybe. Peter the Great. Oh, I think we've lost James briefly, but I'll just talk briefly about Peter the Great then, because he was a figure that I was going to bring up. Peter the Great is interesting because he is he's a reforming figure who simultaneously perceives himself. So his reign is essentially, it's not completely unchecked, but it's not contested to the same degree as some of his others, as some other figures of Russian history around the same kind of time. But he goes on like a mad reforming spree and basically just reforms everything he can lay his hands on. So quite a lot of what you could call modern Russia dates more from this period than from the period preceding him. Yeah, partly for this reason. He's doing a lot of deliberate westernizing, but he's getting very much on the ground himself. And although he kind of fulfills some of the same role as as being aloof in some ways, he is also very keen to aloof in the sense that no, it's the wrong way of putting it actually. So he wants to do a lot of this reforming. He wants to get very hands-on, but he's also looking at things in quite an absolutist fashion. Again, he's doing things very top-down a lot of the time. He creates a new city as St. Petersburg as like a monument to his new project, essentially, and to aid with it as well. But while he is sort of trying to do a lot of this reforming, and he's kind of going around, he's touring, he's finding out what's going on elsewhere in the.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, hello, welcome back.
Sorry about that, my mic disconnected. Go on, I was listening. You were talking about Peter
the Great, yeah.
The Great.
Yeah, so he's going around, he's touring, he's finding out about all the new technologies. He's sort of learning about all this stuff himself. He's doing some amount of science work. I think he even conducts some surgery personally as well. But at the same time, he's also like stripping away quite a lot of the pomp of the Russian court that existed prior. So one of the more famous things is that there used to be, so prior to him, there was all sorts of grandiose procedures around any kind of audience with the monarch. And so you would have to go through various preparations. You would have to go through all these different rites to approach the the sacred Tsar of Russia. He strips all of that back, and I would say probably part of the fact that he's able to do that is because he doesn't need it to bolster his legitimacy anymore. He's able to work quite a lot on the, you might say, the monkey brain of man, in that he is very tall, very imposing, and he's quite erudite, while also being very strong. So he's a physically and physically imposing and somewhat charismatic figure. But he's able to basically reduce it down to be very time efficient, and so he will take meetings, for example, with ambassadors as he's en route to other places, which is completely unbelievable, or would be completely unbelievable to someone even just at the start of his reign.
Sounds in some way similar to a Richard the Lionheart type.
Yeah,
and leaning from the front.
Well, not directly leading from the front in that case. I'm not sure to what extent Peter the Great did. He might have. I know he did a lot of army reforms, and he was very interested in military matters. Of course, he didn't disregard that at all by any means. But yeah, I'm not sure if he was a battlefield commander to the same degree. And it's interesting to contrast Peter the Great in that sense from. So he was to put him to an archetype. There is the European monarch as someone who has like a physical capability that clearly sets them apart as someone who should be in charge.
The lion, yeah.
Mm-hmm. He does not get second guessed, generally speaking, because he is, biologically clearly should be in charge to some degree. Mm-hmm. Which contrast that against, and obviously the interesting thing is that can work in both models, because that kind of figure can both be an absolutist who is not going to be challenged and is going to have a fairly easy time carrying out centralizing projects. They are someone who's going to be able to get a lot more bang out of their a lot more bang for their buck, so to speak, out of reforms and just personally being involved and having more personal power, because they're very hardworking. Usually, they're very erudite and they know how best to organize things. So removing barriers from them is very effective. But at the same time, if they are working in more of a feudal mode, then they are also better able to get people on side, because they have a good amount of charisma and they can demonstrate good results and not be second guessed in the same way as someone who is a little bit more average, or perhaps even just short. I've heard that described as one of the things that was a problem for Nicholas II, is because unlike his father Alexander III, he was not a giant. So he wasn't towering over his people and his subordinates in the same way that even some of his other contemporary family members were. He was just an average sized man, despite being very, very in shape.
Is there anyone from those examples you've mentioned that fits the description that I gave to Qin Shi Huang, the aloof conqueror?
Again, probably the closest person that comes to mind is someone like a Charles XII.
Yes, you mentioned that earlier.
He's not aloof in the same kind of way, but he is a very much a lead from the front kind of guy. He believes in divine right of kings and his unquestionable authority to lead. But at the same time, he is also quite humble in some other ways. So he pretty much insists on sharing the same barracks tribulations as his men. And he basically spends his entire life on campaign, his entire adult life, certainly.
Sounds very different from Qin Shi Huang. I can't think of a parallel with Qin Shi Huang. If anyone watching this can think of a parallel with Qin Shi Huang, I know, of course, they're going to be different because they're Chinese, right? It's going to be a different characteristic to these things. But in terms of the archetype of an aloof conqueror that fits the description that I gave, the thing to remember is also that in the Chinese context, Qin Shi Huang arises out of an absolute almost necessity for China, because there'd been 400 years of constant warring before, with the losses of hundreds of thousands of lives. During the warring states, these armies were huge. So just imagine a sort of, I can't think of a comparison, an early Rome disintegrating quite early on, and then imagine the warring between, let's say, 7 or 8 parts of that. Because China was sort of, I suppose, at that stage anyway, quite geographically isolated. So they didn't have the external pressures that the Romans had, like, north of the Danube and all of that, and north of the Rhine. Just imagine a constant warring with no end in sight. And then Shanyang comes along and reforms the Qin state into this war machine. And then Qin Shi Huang, basically all he needs to do is just put into practice what his ancestors have brought into being, and don't do too much else. Just send your generals off to conquer, and he doesn't actually have to reform much himself. Yeah, of course, he unifies the language after, but that's after he conquers. I can't think of a comparative figure.
In the Western context, they're not perfect comparisons, but what comes to mind is after 2 of the major periods of sort of Roman civil strife or like disintegration, you have similar figures in the Emperor Aurelian, and then the Emperor Justinian of the Byzantine Empire, as we would understand it, but he would have just considered himself Roman. Both of these figures have some of that aloofness about them, but probably more so Justinian, because I didn't really get into the legitimacy aspect, but that is one interesting thing about late Rome in particular, is a certain aloofness that they deliberately try to maintain, and sometimes that comes along with touring, but mostly it's confined to the palace grounds and whatever. To the extent that they were quite fond of certain technologies that would be marvelous to any visitors. It would be practically otherworldly. So you're talking about automatons and even steam power to open the imperial the palace doors, and just all of these contraptions that would do things automatically and move things around. And I think either the late Romans or Byzantines, I can't remember which, are supposed to have had a machine that basically mimicked birds, but purely mechanically, complete with naturalistic movements, flight to some extent, I think, and they would even chirp as well.
I haven't heard of that before.
Yeah, they had it. And they would also have contraptions that would kind of like move various platforms around and lift up the throne and all sorts of things like that. They had a great fascination for various automatons and such devices, and that was one of the methods that they had to try to present themselves as overawing and very far from the status of normal people or even notables who would be coming to visit.
Mm. That's a few things I need to look into. Charles the 12th, I need to look into that. Justinian a little bit more, and that fascination with contraptions and mechanical things, late Roman Empire, that I didn't know about. And of course, also we're linking this on to legacies in stone, and what better legacy in stone than the Great Wall. And in fact, I think a lot of people know this, but this is a commonly held sort of old wives' tale misnomer thing, that the Great Wall was built in one go. No, of course it wasn't. In fact, the Great Wall was always a bunch of separate walls built during the Warring States that Qin Shi Huang attempted to combine and put into a grander vision of, well, we've got these walls, or what are we going to do with them? Let's try and link them all up in some way. So you get great efforts during Qin Shi Huang's lifetime of linking up these walls. Of course, also building his tomb with the use of hundreds of thousands of laborers, but also linking up these walls. So what Qin Shi Huang does, and what we're looking to do, is bring these things forward, bring these buildings forward into our future. He didn't just look at them and go, oh, okay, let's just leave those. They're remnants of the former Warring States period. Now we don't need them anymore. No, he looked at them and thought, no, okay, how can we use these? Oh, I know. Let's use them to keep out the horse peoples, combine them all up, and bring them all together into a unified military vision, rather than sort of leaving them as they are.
Yeah, definitely. I do wonder about the extent to which they were modernized. Do you know much about that?
Well, the sort of typical image we have when we think of the Great Wall, that was mostly the Ming Dynasty wall. So that typical image we have of, I'll get a picture up. Something like that, right? That's the brick stuff. That was all built during the Ming Dynasty. The stuff around, I think it's called Badaling, around modern day Beijing. But the Han Dynasty Great Wall, which followed on very shortly from the Qin Dynasty Great Wall, was the legacy of Qin Shi Huang. They were not bricks, but they were sort of, what would you call it, compressed earth, dotted with turrets every so often. So they were brought together. I mean, a lot of, for example, I visited out in the west, out in Gansu, and the wall goes all the way to Jiayuguan. I think that was built around that time. That's Jiayuguan of the Western Pass. That image. Unfortunately, when I went there, it was under construction, so a lot of it was under scaffolding, but it was still a beautiful sight. Now, I'm not sure, you asked me, when have they been modernized? I think it was more the fact that they were connected. So there would be bits, as I showed before, separate during the Warring States period, but they would build between them. Like, for example, that gap there, they would build through it, build between those gaps, add more to it to bring them all together. All as an effort to deter any horse peoples from breaking into China proper.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, well, you did answer the question in saying that contrasting what they were to what they became, but yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense. I had not heard that, but I would have guessed so.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't make sense, does it, to just leave a wall or a castle, for that matter, to just sit in the rain? That's idiotic. You've got to build with what you have, and we mentioned, emperors and their legacies in stone. I think that has always been the Chinese model. We've touched upon castles. There's not really an equivalent of castle in China, but for a variety of reasons. I think one of them probably because, as you mentioned, castles come into being when there's a great sort of internal feudal struggle, more likely to come into being. But China hasn't had that for very long periods through history, and they tend to build forts and things in wood. Their palaces are wood, mostly. So a lot of the old palaces of course, you had fortified cities. Yeah, you had fortified cities. But a castle, we know a lake when we see a lake, right? We know the difference between a pond and a lake. And castles are something that come into being downstream, I think, of usually one person's vision. I think that's one of the conclusions I've been coming to of late, is that one of the reasons why China didn't build castles was because they tend to build in committee, right? Like, okay, so for example, with this example, you've got lots of different walls built by the different warring states, and then one man comes along and sort of joins them all up. But a castle didn't come about in China, and I'm not sure why that is specifically, but one of the reasons I can think of is that usually a castle is a vision of one person and one architect, and I mean that seems to be the way they've come about in Western history usually, or one king.
I think it's as much due to the fact that, if not more due to the fact that relative to how Europe has been structured, the decentralization in China has taken quite a different form, where the polity more or less remains intact, and it's just the accountability structures and the there's more like an informal decentralization more so than a formal one, and so the idea of an independent or a semi-independent governor being able to build their own fortification is not quite as possible as it is traditionally in Europe. Or is that a wrong interpretation?
Perhaps also just not as necessary. Like you mentioned, that the people remain throughout the time, other than these few exceptions of the Yuan Mongol takeover and the Manchu takeover. There hasn't been much debate as to what a Chinese person is and what the geographic region that denotes China is. That has never been up for debate by and large for 5,000 years since that map I showed you there. That's the core territory. So within that territory, the territory is fragmented over time, but it's always been under a great leader, brought together again, time and time again.
Yeah,
5,000 years.
That's kind of what I mean. Is similar to how the so, for example, the Limes Germanicus was left to fall apart. If the Roman Empire had been sort of reformed maybe 100 years later, after it fell in the West, then perhaps you would basically just see a rebuilding of the Limes Germanicus and the all of the string of fortifications at the frontier of the Roman Empire. But because that didn't happen, the fortifications are, perhaps you could also say, like less coherently sophisticated in that regard. So you're more so trying to defend with more limited resources, although the resources they put into them was still quite significant. The general strategy seems to have been a bit different. If you look at like the Crusader states, for example, in Outremer, their method of defending against the Saracens is more a string of strong points backed by an army, more so than trying to create like a giant wall, completely around themselves. Perhaps that says something to either the resource availability or the mentality or something. But yeah, in China, they seem to be more leaning towards the idea of treating the entire polity as like one giant thing that needs to be protected with like one big wall.
Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
one set of fortifications that goes around the edge of it, and everything internally is much less a consideration for fortification. Whereas everything in Europe is like multi-layered, de facto, perhaps not necessarily entirely planned.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, I think perhaps to our detriment. I think I think when I compare and contrast, I sometimes think they can, keep together. What is it now? 1 billion people. It seems a shame to me that Europe can't. I know they have tried, but of course it's not in the way that we would envision a united Europe. I think that sort of individualism has unfortunately had its downsides for sure. I mean, even 2,000 years after the unification under Qin Shi Huang, we have the man I'm going to bring up later rebuilding much of that Great Wall and making that brick Great Wall that we saw earlier during the Ming Dynasty. So it's been a repeated pattern through history. It's not a model that's been cast away. It's a model that's been revised, brought up again every time. Which seems a shame to me that we can't do that, or we have done and we should again.
Seems like a good segue to me. If you want to go on to your last video.
Yeah. Go on, Rupert. Tell me about your next.
No. Onto your...
my one. My one. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Let's see. Where was I? I mentioned a lot about the Ming, and that is a very big exception to the rule. So I will briefly bring up the third archetype, the endearing uncle. This is Liu Bang, who won the Chu Hung contention, and now he steps into history in a very different way from how any of these other archetypical Chinese rulers steps into history. His parentage is pretty clear. We know that his father, for example, lived until the grand old age of 85. Pretty impressive in those days. Despite the fact that he was taken prisoner for many years by Liu Bang's enemy, Shang Yu, his erstwhile ally during the takedown of the Qin dynasty. So I call him the endearing uncle because there's something about this guy that he somehow manages to bring around himself the most capable men of his age and delegate to them almost everything. He didn't lead from the front. The last example that I'm going to give was a man who led from the front. Liu Bang, there are many stories about him, stories about how he stepped into history. For example, that he was taking a chain gang of labourers. He was a peasant son, and he became a constable of the village. His job was to escort the labourers to the capital of Shenyang to work on the tomb of the emperor. But he was delayed in that march, and he would have been faced with punishment or for being delayed on that march. He has a choice. He chooses between rebellion or punishment, and he chooses rebellion, along with his peasant friends on the side of Mount Mangdang, build up a resistance, what we could call a organized minority, elite. They came to be an elite. If he wasn't of an elite type himself, at least he attracted people to him that were of the elite type, former grand chancellors of the respective warring states. Because it's hard to remember, and I sometimes forget this, that Liu Bang lived through the unification, right? He's living through 256 to 195 BC, so he remembers a time before the unification. All these people do. His enemy, Shang Yu, remembers a time when there was a Chu state. So he becomes the endearing uncle because he ameliorates some of the extremities of the Qin, their legalist code of harsh punishments, going up to cutting off the nose, for example, for pretty big crimes, but not huge crimes, pretty severe punishments. The ideal being that, of course, with severe punishments, there's no crime. At least that's the ideal anyway, to deter. But he ameliorates this by being more loyal to his friends. He would, for example, let slide on some of his friends' bad behavior. So he rewarded loyalty. He was more of a human touch than the aloof Qin Shi Huang that we mentioned earlier. We know him as a man. We know his parentage. We know his foibles, his weaknesses as a peasant, but we also know his skills as a delegator. And his legacy to China is the Weiyang Palace. Oh, someone's mentioned my favorite alcoholic in Chinese history. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, he was a well-known alcoholic. Thank you, Nufflin Magister. If any comments, feel free to add them. Yeah, but that links to what I was saying earlier. He's more of a human. He's more of an endearing uncle, of course, depicted in the TV show King's War that I've covered a fair bit on my channel. And this picture that you're seeing here is Weiyang Palace that he builds very soon after beating Shang Yu, his enemy, during the Chu-Hung contention. And this Weiyang Palace, built in wood that we mentioned, not in stone, at the same time, it serves as the imperial center of China for the next 800 years, all the way up to the Sui dynasty, 600 AD. So all the way from, 200 BC to around 600 AD, he's built the Weiyang Palace. That's that long-lasting legacy to China. And one thing I should mention in that is that he built that even during a time of real uncertainty. He'd only just put down Shang Yu, his enemy. This was around 202 BC. And he builds this with still some minor rebellions to put down left. He starts building palaces. So a lesson to us all, we can build even in times of uncertainty, as he did, as many of our ancestors did as well. And it's time to do so again, I would think.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good comparison. It does seem like fairly close to the sort of charismatic ideal that I laid out. The charismatic type figures trying to deal with various interest groups and not simply dominate everyone, but trying to kind of approach them on their terms to some extent and accept some level of lack of absolute authority, but being okay with that and working within those confines.
Yeah, he was a delegation builder. Didn't lead from the front. Didn't have much book learning. He just knew how to gather to him some very capable men. The three most capable men of his age. Zhang Liang, that guy who tried to assassinate Qin Shi Huang. Han Xin, the general, who did most of his general work. And then, what's the name of the third man? Xiao He, his interior minister. Another very capable man who flocked to him. So for some reason, Liu Bang has this ability to bring in capable men around him and delegate the work to them. Yeah. Wonder if there's any equivalents in European history.
It's not perfect, but the person that first came to mind was Louis XIV. And that might seem like a funny example because he gets associated with absolutism quite a lot, but in actuality, I put him more in the the feudal camp for his ability to, well, essentially because the way that he is able to centralize is through an expert understanding of the relationships that he'd need to cultivate and the power groups that he'd need to ingratiate himself to. And usually he did this through granting basically gifts and patronage and all that sort of thing to local power players. So he'd have figures on the ground who did not necessarily have an official title and didn't have an official job to do such, but they would be very good at bringing people on the regional level on side to whatever Louis XIV wanted. And he would, those figures would basically be able to sway the various parlements at the regional level to do what he wanted. And then combine that with the fact that he was able to work alongside and sort of patronize some of the greater figures of the day to do things like build his fortifications. So the patronage of Vauban, for example, and all of his siege works and his string of fortifications that were built. Obviously it's somebody who recognizes greatness and is able to give them the appropriate amount of power and position and resources to do their thing.
Yes, in that way they were similar. I suppose in a way, though, that Louis XIV isn't started from scratch, is he? Or because Liu Bang did?
He starts from a very divided realm, but it's not. Some of the worst of the troubles had kind of already been put behind him, but his predecessors were struggling with the French wars of religion and all that kind of thing, which was kind of simmering down. They'd come to a kind of agreement, but he ends it much more finally with the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, establishing Catholicism as dominant again, but effectively without too major resistance. And I think the conflict in the Fronde was not necessarily too far behind either. So, yeah, basically a lot of simmering conflicts that could have spiraled into something much worse. But he was able to kind of tame a lot of those forces, and famously one of the ways he did that was the building of Versailles and physically bringing all of and creating the expectation that all of the nobility would come and all the major power players would come and live with him, basically, and he'd be able to essentially keep a close eye on them that way and make sure they weren't doing anything in private that they shouldn't be.
In that way, they're similar too. They're both built. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
And also, it must be said that that was not something that was legally required. It was just essentially a social expectation, and the culture of the day was such that if you could be in Versailles, you would want to be. But it was always a choice. So he was able to create an environment such that everybody kind of wanted to be on board with him, and so that kind of feudal mode of doing things that had existed right up until even the early part of his reign, where all of the various notables and aristocrats would be in their own little realms, and they would they would have their own separate power bases, and they were able to potentially start scheming against the king if they wanted to, and hold him to account in various ways, and sort of keep him apart and maintain their own privileges that way, simply through charisma and culture and court culture. He was able to bring that around, which again is why I think of him more as an effective feudalist than an absolutist in the framework that I've laid out. But you can very easily see how they can bleed into one another in some cases.
It's impressive that he built Versailles from scratch during his reign.
Yeah. Essentially, It was a hunting lodge, and it was pretty much entirely built under him. I don't even think necessarily that much was added. I don't think we're talking about a situation where there was a more primitive Versailles that was then added on by successors. I think it was pretty much built more or less as is under just his reign, which it should be said was very sizable. I think he's still the longest reigning monarch in history.
That's quite an impressive legacy. I recall Kenneth Clark not being such a fan of Versailles. I remember him saying something like he thought the building was dull. I think he described it as quite dull, and he didn't like the. I'm pretty sure this was in Civilization, the episode where he visits Versailles, and I think he commented on the style being rather too much for him, too monotonous, I think were his words, something like that.
think that's a fairly well, not uncommon sentiment.
Although I've never been there myself.
Well, so funnily enough, the last Witan was the hotel was decorated in a similar style. You're directly inspired by the architecture and trappings of Louis XIV's realm. Is the era of his reign?
Even inside the ballroom.
Yes, specifically inside the ballroom.
Oh, right. I noted the repeated pattern of the gentleman with an instrument and the lady with a glass. Repeat. So that's in the Versailles style, is it? I hadn't noticed that.
I believe so. Yeah. Well, the Louis XIV era sort of style of the architectural fashions of the day, I believe.
Oh, I've never been to. I don't think I've ever seen a building of that style. All right, interesting. I remember thinking it was quite a shame they didn't keep the entrance was on a side street. I remember thinking it a shame that they hadn't kept the front, like it was just shops. And I remember coming out of the station and walking up the hill and looking for this grand hotel and thinking, why didn't they keep the front of it with a grand entrance? They just put it on a side street. I thought that was a shame.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe it wasn't allowed by local regulations or whatever. But
maybe
that's perhaps too much in the weeds.
Yeah. Anyway, beautiful inside though. Yeah. Lovely inside. Yeah, grand. Well, I'm nearly got to my final one, my final archetype, Rupert. Do you have another one you want to add before I go into my final one?
I will just sort of round out the model that I laid out with so the type of figure who is more perhaps civic in their legitimacy. And again, this can be combined with either centralized or decentralized models. But so if I were to take probably the most famous example of this being Marcus Aurelius, him being the last of the 5 good emperors that I mentioned earlier during the, I want to say, 2nd century in Rome. 2nd century AD, that is. And he has effectively largely unchecked power. But the way that it's portrayed and the way that it's understood is that he is effectively just a very powerful magistrate. There's a very famous story, which is kind of illustrative of the point, that at one point when he was either on campaign or on tour, I don't recall which, he encounters a woman who basically petitions him. And that was considered to be an ancient right that could be asked of consuls, I believe. And the original impulse of his followers and his court in attendance was to basically shoo her away. But he insisted that it was well within her rights to petition him personally, and so he sat down. He stopped the carriage, stopped all of the train, and sat down and basically heard her out and went on to try to address her grievances as best he could, I believe. Obviously, in most other cases, and what you imagine from kings and emperors a lot of the time, that's almost unthinkable. But this ideal kind of comes and goes at various points, and it's something that is very much written into even the Justinian Code. So even when you have the late Roman emperors and the Byzantine emperors, they are still, in theory, or at least partly self-justifying in this model of being the first servant of state, or like the prime most civil servant who is ultimately still beholden to the people of the nation. Which is, interesting in the case of Justinian, because as I said, they still had all of these techniques for maintaining a perception of being far aloof, and they had certain. It wasn't fully developed yet, but they were starting to develop something like a theological justification for their position, and baking it more into a kind of metaphysic that would justify them being in charge, so they wouldn't have to default to saying that they are merely the servant of the servant of the nation, and they are simply the hardest worker, most prominent member of the civil service, as it were. and it kind of holds on to some of that sense of res publica that was used as legitimacy in earlier Rome. The interesting thing as well is that it comes back around, and the modern forms of civil law that we have in the form of so especially post French Revolution, but also a little bit before then. So a lot of the Enlightenment legal reforms that were pushed through, those were directly on the basis of the Justinian law code. And so the ideal of the enlightened despot or the enlightened absolutist, which I described as well in the case of someone like a Frederick the Great, that is directly taking inspiration from the Justinian code, and that's kind of where they seem to get this idea of being the first servant of state. Even if their position is by that point, up to that point, has been considered a divine right of sorts, and they have inherited their position in a long dynastic cycle, and they treat it purely as property. They're kind of returning to this idea of justifying this position on a legitimacy basis, at least if only propagandistically, if nothing else, but clearly earnestly in some cases as like I said, first servant of state.
It's interesting. I mean, I've given my examples of the three archetypes in Chinese history. With regards to sort of thinking about metaphysics for their legitimacy, the Chinese emperors do have the example of him, of course, being the son of heaven, and he goes up every year to do the sacrifice of water and grain to the gods in the Forbidden City. That's later on, so that would apply to the last example I'm going to give. But earlier on, there is a little bit of something like this. Is that clear on the screen? It's a little bit dark for some reason. I'm not sure why. The
dynastic cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's the idea of the mandate of heaven, and certainly Liu Bang would have seen himself in this way. There is indeed a peasant at the end of the Qin dynasty. There is indeed a peasant revolt. Bandits do raid the countryside. There are terrible things that happen, and then he comes in and brings peace and builds infrastructure as he does, and that is something articulated first by the Duke of Zhou back in. Oh, this was, wow, crikey! This was Duke of Zhou was around 1000 BC, I think, around that kind of time period. He first articulated the idea of the mandate of heaven, gained by someone of righteous cause, to take down the degenerate and disintegrating dynasty. But in some ways, someone like Qin Shi Huang doesn't really fit into that, because he's bringing order where there was no order before. Like, it wasn't. The cycle works more in Chinese history when there's simply a dynasty giving way to another dynasty. Like, for example, with the Shang giving way to the Zhou, and that is the time period in which Zhou Gong is writing. But Qin Shi Huang doesn't fit into that, because he's not taking over a dynasty. He's bringing order to the people. Now, whether this is good or not is besides the point. He is bringing an order. So it doesn't, in some aspects, doesn't fit into that. But the next example I'm going to give certainly does. Should I get into that last one now?
I was just going to say, in the purest form of the divine right of kings, there is the similar idea that the physical status of the realm can be, in some sense, a reflection of the monarchs, but it's a little bit more confused in that there is also in the justifications for it, there is also the provision that sometimes only the king is being punished, or sometimes only the nation is being punished. You can't necessarily second guess what God's will is in this context, and so there isn't exactly a clause for justification of any kind of revolt, or like any peasant uprising or anything like that, because the refrain is always given that perhaps you were misinterpreting God's will, basically, or you're pretending to take it into daring to take it into your own hands, and therefore you may incur further punishments upon yourself. And perhaps it was not the king who was at fault here, and it was actually you being bad subjects. So the punishment was not against the king, but against you, the people yourselves. So there's kind of rhetorically built in this idea that no peasant uprising is ever justified by divine right of kings, except perhaps maybe retroactively.
I mean, also, as we know, there are not many examples of successful peasant uprisings in the European frame of reference.
You can get a bit tautological with that. So, for example, I would probably call the Shuanari relatively successful. No, not the Shuanari, the Jacquerie, rather, sorry. But only because the objectives of the peasants in that case were relatively moderate, and they were able to kind of carry out most of them. So in that case, the peasants mostly just wanted a relaxation / renegotiation of their feudal contracts and their feudal dues. And by going and burning down the chateaus, and specifically the legal libraries, they were basically able to do that by removing the records of their own particular feudal contracts. So they necessarily had to be renegotiated. Obviously, a ton of them were punished, clearly, but fundamentally they did get in the end what they wanted.
What was that example you mentioned there, Rupert?
The Jacquerie.
How to spell
that? Jacques, as in the name, without the S at the end, E-R-I-E.
Oh. I never heard of them before. Right, I'll add that to my list of things to check after this. Charles II, Jacquerie.
Funnily enough, arguably the Ming in some sense as well, because obviously they were eventually came to be taken over by a peasant, right? Or a peasant that became the head of a monastery.
Yeah, that's a good segue.
Yeah,
that is the last archetype. It really is an exception to the rule. He's a warrior emperor. He was really, I mean, all the dynasties I've studied, how many is it now? 5,000 years worth of, and all the founding emperors. This guy is an exception to the rule. He was a warrior emperor, an impressive individual, starting from nothing, orphaned at the age of 16, his parents dying, and he spent time, as you mentioned, wandering the south of China as a Buddhist. Well, I should say he joined a Buddhist monastery, but then had to leave because they didn't have enough food for him, and then he wandered the streets. And he really was a warrior. He joined the Red Turban Rebellion, which was a broad tent of disparate factions. You had the people who believed in some kind of Song restoration. That was, of course, the Ming coming after the Yuan. And that I mentioned that earlier, the population drop. So that's that drop there you see on the top right picture between sort of 1100 to 1200 towards the end of the Yuan dynasty. That's reflective of mostly the north of China just sort of hollowing out and everyone moving south, because it's a pretty awful regime to live under if you were Han Chinese. They brought in all sorts of regulations, some perhaps familiar to us now, to restrict any kind of resistance. Things like the Li Jia system. So, for example, you'd have 20 households, and at the head would be a Mongol. And you'd have a certain person assigned to tell on other households. Anyway, Zhu Yanzhang, as he came to be known, but he was born Zhu Chongba, finds the Red Turban Rebellion, and he's described there as a ragged monk with a red turban approaching the city gates. This is the Red Turban Rebellion that was already going on. And I should also mention, this is a key lesson from history. Don't be the first rebellion. It's very hard to step forward first in Chinese history, or world history for that matter, to put down a regime, because the first one to rebel usually gets taken out. This is the same thing that happened with the Qin dynasty. The first rebellion was the Dazi Shang rebellion, and that was put down brutally. The second one, led by Shang Yu, who I mentioned earlier, was a blue blood of the former Chu state. He was a general, so he could rally popular appeal, and his rebellion, of course, helping Liu Bang at the beginning, was the one that would take down the Qin. And this also happened again with this Red Turban Rebellion. They were the ones who helped, I suppose, umbrella Zhu Yanzhang into existence. He was a commander in Guo Zixing's army for quite a long time. And in fact, ends up marrying his adopted stepdaughter, I think. In any case, he takes down the Yuan dynasty, moving north, and has a reputation of two sides, as it says there, towards bureaucratic officials and landlords. He bore a fierce and intimidating visage, but towards the common people, he was a white-bearded elder with a compassionate face and kind words. If one didn't see his true face, perhaps he might have appeared to be the benevolent ruler of the people that the people had long dreamed of. He really, really is an exception to the rule in Chinese history, the warrior emperor, very rare example. It's very interesting reading modern history books about him, because they, by and large, tend to completely ignore the fact that what he did early on in his career, taking down the Mongol Empire in China, to focus on his purges that happened later on in his career. Because with Zhu Yanzhang, he was a self-made man with no family around him, and certainly he became what some might call paranoid later on, with regards to his safety at the top. So it's very interesting to read Victorian historians, because they immediately recognize him as a great man, as a patron of the arts early on, and a bringer of order, and a restorer of Chinese rule in China. Whereas modern historians immediately assume and describe him as awful, before mentioning any of the facts of his career early on. So yeah, he is the final archetype of all the ones I mentioned. And there might be other sub ones, but those are the general archetypes of Chinese emperorship in Chinese history.
Yeah, it's I mean, obviously the warrior emperor or the warrior king is much more common in the European context.
Yeah, that's for certain. Yeah. Yeah, it's just not seen as in China, it's not seen as a thing that you get your hands dirty doing. Yeah. And also there's the fact that even nowadays, Chinese emperors, they're anything but an emperor in name, right? They're not figures who are great orators usually. They're not the type of people who stand in front of people and get everyone excited or passionate about something. They're people who sit down and write something out and send it off to their mandarins, who will spread it around the country. kind of like now, no one ever sees a Chinese ruler nowadays as charismatic. There are exceptions to the rule. Jiang Zemin was seen as rather charismatic. He spoke fairly good English. I've seen videos of him. But this all plays into the fact, it all goes into the fact that Chinese leaders are men of the pen generally, who write and delegate rule rather than lead from the front. As you mentioned, in the European context, there are a lot more warrior kings.
Yeah, and also probably more so that directly get involved with things themselves, whether that be reforms or whatever. So I mentioned Peter the Great, who I probably didn't necessarily give the best explanation of, but he was a figure who was doing a lot very personally and trying to get his hands dirty in as many different ways as possible, right down to like learning about ship construction. I think he impersonated a Dutch shipbuilder for a time. For the sake of just like understanding the actual manual work involved in building modern ships.
He impersonated a Dutch shipmaker. All right.
I believe so, yeah.
Oh, grand. Did he have to put on a costume?
Presumably, yeah. And I can't imagine it being very convincing because he was he was like slightly more than 2 meters tall.
Oh yeah, I can't imagine him getting away with that. Did he go out into the docks then and get his hands dirty? Is that how the story goes? Oh, it's quite impressive. Yeah, there are not many examples of that in Chinese history. Yeah, not any I can think of other than this guy. Let me think. Yeah, no. The most sort of down-to-earth one was Liu Bang, and even he was a delegator. He would just sit in wherever his palace was and write a dictate or talk to one of his friends and tell them what to do. Was this Peter the Great very loyal then as well? Was he a man who helped out his friends? Because that sort of fits into that archetype of a man getting down with the folk, as it were.
Funnily enough, I don't believe he did. I don't think he was.
No.
I think he ended up executing his own son.
Oh dear. Okay, he doesn't fit that tick that box then. Interesting. Yeah. Oh no. I of course I should have mentioned the last legacy in stone would of course be the Ming Rule and his grandson. Perhaps not Zhu Yuanzhang himself, but his grandson, the Yongle Emperor, built the Forbidden City, and that's lasted until this very day. 600 years later, that was a sort of zenith of the Ming Dynasty, and during that we had the Zhenghe armadas reaching the east of Africa at that time. But in a way, expressing that idea of Chinese emperorship, they went for tribute. Basically, they didn't go for trade or for taking over, which they could have done. Their ships were huge at the time. They just didn't have the motivation to do that. Overarching all of this is the idea of Zhongguo, the idea of the Middle Kingdom. And in a way, when we went to them, after all, the Europeans went to China for a variety of reasons, for tea, for silk, for trade, quote unquote trade. But that fit into their idea of themselves. So when we demanded, an embassy, it just kind of didn't make much sense. It's like, well, what do you want an embassy for? You're going to go back to where you came from, right? So, yeah.
Funnily enough, as well, to tie back into something we were talking about earlier, I believe the one thing of all of the European goods that China was interested in was the automatons. So when we came to trade with them, I think the one thing that they were interested in
clocks. Clocks.
Clocks.
Yeah, very, very interesting clocks. Yes, yeah, that's right. Matteo Ricci. Yeah.
But yeah, it kind of feeds into this same mindset of using some of these very exact mechanical contraptions to, as some kind of expression of power, perhaps, or something that appeals to their sense of being aloof.
Maybe. I mean, that was one of the things that Matteo Ricci took over. Clocks was one of the things that people wanted. They also wanted Euclid's translations. He did translations of Euclid. That was geometry and that maths. That was one of the main things they wanted. Maps as well were in demand. Maps. They didn't particularly want many of our other things, but those were things of great interest to them. And it's quite a shame, really, that the Manchus came in because, even Matteo Ricci and one of the Catholic converts, Xu Guangqi, warned the Ming dynasty, no, watch for your north. Don't worry about the foreigners. They're not here to take over. They're here to trade or whatever. And they were right. The greater threat was to the north. And in fact, one of the story goes, Matteo Ricci was on his way to Beijing, bringing cannon specialists over to the Ming dynasty, cannon gunners and people with expertise in that area. They're on their way to Beijing as it was falling to the Manchus. So,
funnily enough, maybe you might have seen the map. I know it does the rounds every now and then. There was a plan initially for Spain to try an invasion of China from the southeast. I think they were going to use the Philippines as a jumping off point, but the failure of the armada that tried to invade England kind of put pay to that idea or put it on indefinite hold. So that might have that assessment of Europeans only wanting to trade might have aged poorly in another world.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. I need to look into that a little bit more. I'm not sure how serious their intention was. So I'm not sure why they would do it. I know they did have, in Macau, they did have a Catholic, they had a monastery there. And, well, it was Hong Kong at the time, I think. I'm not sure whether they had Macau at that point. And there was back and forth between the viceroys at that time in China and this colony that they were sort of uncomfortably letting exist. I'm not sure how serious that was. It is an interesting question. What would have happened if had they done that? Because they would have faced a united China rather than a China as it was in the 1800s, which was not united. It was.
I think we're still talking about late Ming, so still fairly weak for all the same reasons that led them to falling to the Manchu, as I call them. What did you call them? Manchu?
The Manchus. Yeah. These are very interesting things to think about. I suppose any dynasty, any civilization in its winter is in some ways ripe pickings. I suppose. Yeah. Who knows? I know that there is an example of the colony on Taiwan, or Formosa, at the time, that faced pretty fierce resistance and was cleared out by the Ming. Towards the end.
Was that the Dutch? I thought that was the Dutch.
Yes, the Dutch. Yeah, that's right. The Dutch. Yeah. Perhaps a topic for another video.
Yeah. As far as I know, their expectation was basically along the lines of, they'd done it to the Aztec and the Incan empires, so why not to China as well?
I'll need to look into that. Certainly not something Matteo Ricci wanted. He was actually very sympathetic to China. He liked Confucianism. He saw it as a precursor to Christianity, and he identified that pretty early on.
similar in a sense to Japan then, because the Spanish and Portuguese both had designs on Japan as well for a time, but the English and Dutch jointly sort of stopped that from happening. I don't remember the fellow's name, but he's renowned for being like the English samurai or something, which is slightly not quite right to what his position actually was. But he was a sailor or navigator, I think, who washed up as part of a shipwreck and ended up advising. I want to say it was either Tokugawa Ieyasu or Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Basically, just informing them about ongoing schemes amongst the Catholic European populations to try and usurp power there and subjugate Japan and turn it into another like colony of sorts. But obviously that didn't pan out, and all the Catholics got expelled, and consequently for the aid that they rendered, the Dutch were given their single trading island.
I mean, it's just going back to the point about the Ming. I mean, they were almost 400 years old by that point. They were founded in the 1300s. So by 1600, they were. This is almost Roman Empire levels of length of time, 400 years. So when we think about how weak they were, I think it's important to keep that in mind. And I don't think any order lasts, where we can see examples through history. There are a variety of rules. The sort of 400 to 800 year rule is a good sort of rule of thumb. The Ming were tired by that point. The Wanli Emperor, for example, never left his palace. He was completely detached from reality, whereas, like we've just described there, the founder was on horseback, and a soldier. So up to a point, there is an unavoidability of that cycle coming into fruition, and certain factors and certain peoples speed up the process or take advantage of it. The Ming were weak by that point. That's true, but I think they would have put up more resistance than the mid 1800s Manchus did. That's for sure.
Yeah, hard to say. It's fairly hypothetical, but quite possibly. Certainly, with the Spanish operating on some quite extreme logistics lines and communication lines, it would have been difficult from that perspective. But you never know with the discrepancy of technology and methods and all that kind of thing, depending on how the Spanish could bring themselves across and ally with various groups who by that point were discontent. That's usually how they made it work elsewhere. So, hard to say. No one would have guessed from the outset that the Aztecs and Incan Empire would have been as brittle as they ended up being.
Were there not a lot of sort of ethnic dividing lines in that region? Because in China, there's never been that. So that the conquistadors, were they not taking advantage of? I know we might see them all as the same, right? But they didn't see themselves in that way. The Aztecs and their sort of client, the groups from which they would get their sacrifices and so on. Were they not divided along more lines than China was at that time?
They were in some ways, but I believe the Aztecs in particular were still basically a similar people, albeit with a slightly different set of religious practices. But even then, it was not so far divorced from what the other Mexican peoples believed in. It's just that the actual rites that were being used. So, for example, my understanding is that the other Mexican peoples basically considered the sacrifices to be a little bit more symbolic than literal, whereas the Aztecs just went with the most literal and hardcore interpretations of the same religious truths that elevated it all to a mass blood orgy, basically. Just sacrificing, human sacrifice all over the place.
Well, let's put it that way. The conquistadors would not have faced such scenes in China. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think we've covered everything very thoroughly there, haven't we, Rupert?
Yeah, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground.
Yeah, it went on a bit longer than I was thinking, but thanks for hanging there with me and going through that. That was fun.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it's been fun.
Thank you very much, Rupert, and thank you everyone for listening. And that's a few more things on my list to learn about Charles the 12th. I'll look more into Versailles and see if my experience of that place was matching the Louis XIV style. I'll look into that. Thank you very much, Rupert. Good evening all.
Thank you. Good night all.